So we're in Neurodiversity Awareness Week. You have a dyslexia bill passing through Parliament. Before I ask you about that, can I ask a very basic question?
Sure.
What is dyslexia?
Oh, that's a great question. It's really important. It's technically, the word means the inability to read, but what it means in the educational sense is a neurological incapability at taking the code, the alphabetic code on a page, and translating that into language, into the oral use of language.
Okay.
So now, dyslexia comes with lots of other conditions often, and it manifests in different ways in different people, and there's a range. But ultimately, at its core, dyslexia describes somebody who has a neurological difficulty at taking the code that's on a page and turning it into language in their head.
Okay, so this would mean that reading can be a bit tricky, let's say.
Well, so for instance, for somebody who's dyslexic, then reading is harder. Now, of course, sometimes you can be badly taught, and that's why you can't read, but then you can pick it up as quickly as anybody else does. Most people find when they're taught to read that they pick that up at the normal pace. But if you're dyslexic, that's because you find it more difficult to do that because of a neurological difference. You think differently.
Yeah. So I'm struggling to get this. Dyslexia means that reading and learning to read is really hard. You're a politician.
Right.
It must be pretty hard being a politician if reading's hard. So how does that work? I mean, how does it work being a dyslexic politician?
So for me, my dyslexia manifests now in a number of ways. Firstly, I read relatively slowly. But I read fast enough that I can take a script in front of me and, articulate it, project it, as I did in all those press conferences during COVID. But if I'm reading it for the very first time, it's not nearly as good. But that's true of most people as well. That's the first thing. The second thing is, for me, I often switch letters around. I transpose letters when I see them on the page in how they make an impression inside my head. And even though I've been taught how to read and retaught how to read when my dyslexia was identified, and therefore I can now read perfectly functionally, it's just a bit slower than most people's, I still get this transposition. But if I'm reading something, context normally allows me to sort that out as I'm reading.
So it didn't stop you being a politician. It doesn't stop you, if you're like,
no. And anyway,
executing the
right. So I get exactly. So I've got ways of working around it.
Yeah.
But also, a lot of politics is about your oral ability without the written word, right? So your ability to debate in Parliament, for instance, or answer questions in an interview like this, discussion like this. My dyslexia makes absolutely no impact on at all because I've always, had the gift of the gab. Yeah. And the other thing that it does is it makes me concentrate on the big issues because I have to essentially.
So one of the big issues that we seem to have at the moment is the Dyslexia Bill, the ability to, what is the Dyslexia Bill? What are you trying to do with that?
So what I want to do is make sure that every child gets screened when they're at primary school. So many people only had their dyslexia picked up when they were adults, or like me when I got to university. And instead we should be screening at primary school so that kids get the support that they need, and they should be screened anyway for their literacy and their language abilities. But if you've got a gap between your literacy and your language ability, so a child, for instance, might be very good at oral language, have a broad vocabulary, but find it difficult to write and to spell and be slow at reading, then you have a specific problem that needs to be addressed.
It seems to me that this is a fairly obvious thing for a government to do. So why hasn't it been done before?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, how many things in the world are obvious things to do that haven't been done yet?
Captain Hindsight.
There's a long. I think there's a long explanation for why this hasn't happened over a long period. There is a drive within literacy. Those who are pushing for literacy as an important goal to make sure that the standard techniques of teaching that are evidence-driven, like synthetic phonics, which work extremely well for straight line thinking people and also work for dyslexic people, that they are entrenched. And if you say, well, this person's dyslexic, then they don't, they want to say, let's put the focus on getting synthetic phonics through. Now, I agree with, and I am science-led on this, that the evidence demonstrates that synthetic phonics is the best way of teaching to read and to write and to decode that alphabetic code. But I think the focus on making that happen after a generation in which English was taught in ways that the evidence has subsequently demonstrated wasn't always as effective as it could be, and I say all that diplomatically, I think the focus on that has meant that there hasn't been as much focus on the 10% or so of pupils for whom that decoding is particularly difficult. Now, all of this pushes in the same direction, if you like, which is that, we've got to try to resolve this problem for everyone.
Yeah.
And you're not going to get to near 100% literacy rates unless you have a program that works for everyone, and that does require extra support for some people.
And synthetic phonics works for non-dyslexic people as well as dyslexic people.
Well, that's what the evidence shows.
Right.
Now, of course, there is dyslexia as a spectrum, and there are other neurodisabilities and elements of neurodiversity, which mean that for some people, reading is always going to be particularly difficult. But the evidence is that both for dyslexics and for non-dyslexic people, synthetic phonics is a very, very effective teaching method. And there are, as Churchill once said about democracy, it's the worst form of government except all the others that have been tried from time to time. And synthetic phonics is the worst form of teaching English except for everything else that's been tried, as far as the evidence that I've seen shows.
And the Dyslexia Bill, will this lead to synthetic phonics teaching?
Well, it doesn't specify that, because I think that should be evidence driven. I think you should look at what works. What I care about is the screening. Because in my experience in government, what gets measured gets managed, and there isn't nearly enough data on how children do. Now, there are some schools. I don't want to take away from the brilliant schools that assess and then follow, and then if a kid is behind, then they will make sure that there's a follow-up assessment and there's extra support put in. There are schools that do this brilliantly, but that isn't across the board. And there's one other thing, Martin, and I don't want this to be a political point, but the access to this sort of screening and indeed assessment for dyslexia is much, much more likely to be available in the private sector, in private schools, than in state schools. So for me, it's the universality that's important. I admire the schools where this goes really well. What I worry about is that it isn't across the board.